I think we have to be careful that we don't silo ourselves off even further. And while I'm all for what a decolonial approach to the study of Islam would look like, it has to be articulated paradoxically in language that, it, in a non-jargony way, that those of us who don't necessarily buy into it can argue with and and digest and struggle with, because that's ultimately what we do in the academy. So I think that it's yeah, I think that, to reiterate, I think I'm a little bit more sympathetic than I was, but it has to be done properly, and I don't think I've yet seen it done properly.
Okay, so that leads to my next question. Would you not consider the study Quran as an example of the kind of approach that Dr. Lombard advocates? I mean,
Yeah, I think in many ways it is. I haven't looked at it for a while, but it's all insiders speaking devotionally to one another, and I think it's meant for Muslims, which is good. I think that's important. I think the more critical or semi-critical resources that Muslims have to understand their tradition, the better. I mean, it's only going to make Muslims stronger in their belief, all for the good. But in terms of theory and method, and in terms of, we have to ask ourselves, well, what's going on here? And that's where I think what I tried to do in that article is sort of look at some of the language that is used. So you can't just. I think it's maybe almost the opposite of Cook and Krona, when Cook and Krona said in the origins of Hagerism that, this is a book written by infidels for infidels, and anyone with a grain of faith will find this. I think that's the opposite. Is like it shut out critical Western scholarship. So maybe if we have Cook and Krona as a thesis, if we have the study of Quran as the antithesis, maybe, just maybe, we get that Hegelian synthesis somewhere. I'm not sure what that would look like.
peace, everyone, and welcome back to the Real Talk podcast, where we host academic insights on Islam for the curious mind. I'm your host, Tehran, alongside my brilliant co-host, Roxana, and today we're honored to be joined by Professor Aaron Hughes, Dean's Professor of the Humanities, and Philip S. Bernstein, Professor of Religion at the University of Rochester, and a leading voice in the critical study of religion. Many of you will know him from his provocative and important works like The Invention of Jewish Identity, Muslim Identities, and Introduction to Islam, and of course, Theorizing Islam, Disciplinary Deconstruction and Reconstruction. Today, we're primarily digging into his article, The Current Status and Problems of Islamic Origins. But I want to begin elsewhere with a book that made serious waves a decade ago, Theorizing Islam, The Tyranny of Authenticity. But before we get into that right there, I'd love to start with a bit of your story. What first drew you to the academic study of religion, and how did you come to focus specifically on the question of early Islam and Islamic origins?
Yeah, well, before we begin, just let me say thank you. It's an absolute honor and delight to be here today, even albeit virtually, with the two of you to talk about my work. And I realize the audience might not be overly technical, which is the kind of audience I prefer. So I won't get into super technical things. But how did I first do it? I'm approaching 60, so there's all kinds of ways I can do this. I mean, I could say, well, when looking backwards, I can say, I was the first person in my family to go to university. My dad grew up in poverty on the east end of Glasgow in Scotland. My mom was the daughter of two of from what I can tell and what I can document. I'll get into this a little bit later, although I know it's not so modern. My grandparents, my maternal grandparents, were, from what I can tell, the first two Shia immigrants to Canada in the 1920s, and they were fur traders up in the Canadian Arctic, and they were one of the pioneering Muslim families in Canada that were responsible for the first mosque that was built there in Edmonton in 1938, which is my hometown. So I kind of grew up in the shadow of that mosque. In fact, my first teacher in Islam and in Arabic was one Salim Ghanem, who I now document as sort of the first homegrown Muslim theologian in Canada.
Mm.
from Shiho, Saskatchewan, if any of your listeners are familiar with the Canadian prairies. So I was always interested in Islam. I was always interested in religion. My mom, as probably a first generation Muslim immigrant, Arab immigrant, knew nothing about it. So when I went to university, I wanted to know more about it. I learned Arabic properly as opposed to just from my grandparents. I began to study Islam critically or historically. And I guess you could say the rest is history. So I went to graduate school, traveled in the Islamic world, learning Arabic, and I've just love the tradition, not only because it's my own tradition, but also because I think it's important to study. But I think, and maybe this might be a nice segue, Tara and Roxana, into the conversation, is when I went to graduate school, I think because I had a certain familiarity with Islam. I didn't feel like I had to treat it with kid gloves the way I think a lot of people do. And I was interested in critical questions about things like identity formation, things like boundary maintenance, things like what happens when religions cross culture. So it was those types of questions and issues that I learned in graduate school that I took to the tradition that I was most familiar with. And I guess began a career or a lifetime of trying to put them into conversation. And perhaps before we even get into that, I could say that, my very first week on the job as a sort of young, wet behind the ears assistant professor was the week of September 11th, 2001. And I was teaching at a large urban Canadian university, the University of Calgary. And it was awkward. It was awkward. It was crazy. It was difficult, and I think it really left a mark on me and so many of my generation on what it meant to study Islam and what it meant to study religion. And I think only now, as we're approaching the next generation, I think is the academic study of Islam becoming a little more comfortable with itself, as opposed to having to simply be reactive to larger geopolitical forces. So I hope that sort of explains I don't know if that quite explains how I got into the critical study of religion, but I think it does. I mean, it was just like, and I think maybe most importantly, is I think that after September 11th, I mean, people were beginning to, a lot of people began to say, well, Islam is X or Islam is Y or Islam is Z. And I was like, you know what? Islam is X, Y, and Z and A, B, and C, and D, and E, and F, and all kinds of things. So how can we simply lock it in to one thing? And so I became very critical of that. And I think, I hope what will sort of segue or meander throughout the conversation is my understanding of Islam is it's a big, bold, beautiful, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic tradition that we don't have to treat with kids' gloves because it's not going anywhere. It's a beautiful tradition. So that's kind of my whole take on it. I don't feel like, oh, well, Islam has this or it's that. Or I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful tradition.
And that's an excellent segue to my next question because in the tyranny of authenticity, you mentioned some of your concerns with people saying Islam is A, no, Islam is B, no, Islam is C. And talking to Roxana, I wanted to adapt some of what I read in that book into this script, but she was like, well, it was written over 10 years ago. It might be dated.
Years ago.
And maybe his ideas about it have changed, but I just wanted to get your take. In the tyranny of authenticity, you were already, I mean, I'm sorry, in the tyranny of authenticity, have you found yourself reflecting at all on your observations about the state of Islamic studies since then? I'm curious whether anything in the field has shifted in ways
Yeah.
you didn't expect or perhaps confirmed what you already were seeing at the time.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. I think that's a good question. First of all, I still can't believe that was 10 years ago. That there's symbolism in there for life. I think it just I what I would say is things have changed. The field's changed. I've changed, but I do think that the study of this, I think, as I said earlier, I think we're just now reaching the second generation of the academic study of Islam, at least in North America. Can't say Britain so much because of the sort of the history of Orientalism. But I do think that the UK and Europe is sort of beholden, for better or worse, I oftentimes think for worse, to trends that occur in the US and Canada. Um, so I would say that the study of Islam isn't as apologetic And I think there's a number of reasons for this. I think that, when as I said, after September 11th, I think a lot of people that were studying Islam were people that weren't either f overly familiar with the tradition. They didn't grow up in it. They'd either, just began to study in grad school, or they were converts to Islam. I think and that they needed to apologize. They needed to say, well, and that this will probably take us into the study of early Islam. Like if you read the sources properly, you can tell that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was female friendly, was LGBTIQ2 plus friendly, all this kind of stuff. So, and to me, I have no problem with people doing that. Absolutely no problem. But just say that what you're doing is theology. Don't try to don't try to masquerade it as the critical study of religion. So I think a lot of that has maybe receded to the background. And what we're beginning to see now, and I think this is maybe the new iteration of it. And I must admit I'm conflicted, and that is the call to decolonize the study of Islam. And a younger version of me would have said, "Oh, come on, what does that mean?" But I just finished writing a book on the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is the Bill of Rights. And as I was writing it, I began to look at indigenous critiques of the Canadian Charter. And I was like, things that we take for granted, things like, freedom, individual, and all these things that are enshrined in our constitutions. When you look at indigenous critiques, they're like, well, what does this mean? That we don't believe in individuality in the same way that, settler colonials do. So I'm I think that so that's a long-winded way of saying that I'm interested in what a decolonial approach to the study of Islam would or will look like, but I need to be presented it well in a way that makes sense to those of us that engage in the critical study of religion. So in fact, I just think too many people say, well, that person's white, they can't speak about Islam. We need a decolonial approach. Those are just buzzwords and they mean very little. So I would like to see an articulate definition of what it means to decolonize the study of Islam. And then I can judge it. I can judge it because a buddy of mine, Russell McCutcheon, and I have written a couple books. One is called 50 Religion in 50 Words. I can't remember what it's called. Religion in 50 words and religion in 50 more words. And in each one of those words that we take in those two volumes, we try to show, well, each word that we use in the study of religion comes from somewhere, and often where it comes from is a particular Christian, has a Christian genealogy to it. So I think I'm open to it. So to maybe answer your question more succinctly, I think some of the things have changed. I think I've changed. I've gotten older. I've gotten less. I'm more ecumenical. And I really want to see what some of these approaches to the study of Islam looks like. So I need to see a good decolonial approach. So if anyone is out there listening, and you're an academic and you're interested in writing a Islam in a decolonized perspective, I would love to see it. And I have or edited a couple book series that I think could be interesting too. So I hope I.
No, 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 you definitely and then some and touched on some things that we'll definitely talk about later in the podcast. But in the tyranny of authenticity, not to continue on with that, and we'll definitely move on after this question. You were already pointing out how identity politics and demands for authentic representation can shape the boundaries of scholarship. Do you see the same dynamic at play in how Islamic origins are studied today? Are certain historical claims off limits or at least harder to make because of those same pressures? As some people may already know, having read decolonial work in Islamic
Yeah.
studies, it does kind of seem like certain historical claims by certain people who might be outside of the tradition not tends to not be received well by people within the tradition.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a good point, and I do think that that's why I made the case, and I'm not certainly not the first person or the only person to make that, but I think number of people you've had on this podcast as well have tried to make the case that the study of religion needs, or the study of Islamic origins needs to migrate from Islamic studies back into late antique studies, because as it is now, I think I've been to so many workshops or conferences where someone, usually it's a non-Muslim white guy, who will sort of speak about Christian origins, and then Muslims in the room will say, "You can't say that. How can you speak like that? You're a white person that speaks with white privilege." And I mean that to me that's such a ridiculous argument because it shuts down conversation. But at the same time, I think it allows us to see the tension that goes on with this. I mean, when we look at Islamic origins, we're looking at the origins of a tradition. And I think given the history of Orientalism, which has always tried to show that Islam is nothing more or less than the sum of its other monotheistic parts, I don't know how helpful that is. And that's why, I mean, myself and a couple few other people have tried to say, well, let's let's go back and rethink what it means to look at the origins of Islam. I mean, rather than posit discrete religions, Muslim, Jew, Christian, I think it's much more helpful to sort of see a number of social groups that are in a sort of with borders that are only projected retroactively. And I think we need to sort of begin to appreciate that. So I think because the study of Islamic origins has been so politicized since the 1800s, if not before, going back to it's a fraught subject, but I think some people are doing it so well. I think of people like Ilka Lindstad, who you had on the show a few, well, that I've seen him on here, Philip Wood, people like Jack Tanis. So I think we're slowly seeing a change in the way Islamic origins are studied. But I think when you go to religious studies conference, which tend to be more ecumenical and more theological than critical, as soon as you mention Islamic origins, and you're not a Muslim, hackles go up.
It reminds me of what I witnessed, or what Roxana as well witnessed at the ICSA conference from over the summer, where Ahmed Al-Jalad was speaking about a certain topic, and he basically said origins of Islam, and there was another Muslim academic in the audience who said, Ahmed, your name is Ahmed. What do you mean origins of Islam? You know, kind of, and I've gotten that from other Muslims as well when I speak about the emergence of Islam. It's, you know, we take it for granted it came from a divine origin sent from the sky. You know, everybody knows the traditional account. And so to hear something as in the origins of Islam as if it's a mystery, yeah, kind of sends up red flags for some people.
It really does, and for academics too. And I mean, it's unfortunate, but I mean, look, we can see it. There's no reason why we can't keep these things separate. Islam is it's a universal tradition. If we want to make it, ahistorical, we can do that. But at the same time, things come from somewhere, and it's up to us as a historian. We can't work on the assumption that God is a historical actor in history. We can't work on the assumption that books fall from heaven. We have to sort of look into this. My sense, Taryn and Roxana, is that since some of my work has come out, and I'm not saying my work is the catalyst for it, but I've now see a lot of young Muslim scholars who come out who are familiar with their tradition, who are comfortable in the tradition. They can now apply more critical methods to it. And I think they're much more critical than, say, scholars in the North American Academy, where identity politics reigns supreme.
In your article, the current status and problems of Islamic origins, which is the crux of the conversation today, you write that theory and method need to go even more meta, which is an interesting, really interesting take, to really address the deeper problems in the field. Can you unpack that a bit? And what does going meta actually look like in practice? And what kind of
Yeah.
dead ends is it meant to help us avoid?
That'd be a nice slogan for a t-shirt. I'm going meta. The I think, but what I mean is that I think to anyone that's going to approach Islamic origins it does so through particular methods or particular theories. So whether that's sociological, whether that's philological, whether that's historical. So I think that we're aware of that. How do we do it? But I think my call to make it a little bit more meta is to say, well, let's shine the torch or the flashlight back a little bit further and say, first of all, like, why are we doing this? Why are we engaging in this project of Islamic origins? And then I mean even more meta, it's like let's interrogate the terms that we use. Like, let's interrogate something like Muslim. What does Muslim mean at the time of the Prophet? What does Christians mean? And I think too often we have this really naive understanding of what religion is. And let me just sort of segue a little bit. Is I was at a workshop on football. I'm a big fan of football, and I write about football now, which is Americans call soccer. And in football, religion, and the MENA, or Middle East and North Africa region, in Istanbul like a few months ago, and everyone was they were all social scientists. They were very good about unpacking, what politics were, what society was. But when it came to religion, they were all kind of rendered silly. And because I think too often we take our own assumptions of what religion are if we grew up in a religion, and when we apply that, and we assume that that's what religion is in other times and other places. So I think too often when we look at Islamic origins, and I imagine we'll talk about people like Fred Donner a little bit, we take terms that couldn't have existed at the time of the prophet. And when we do that, when we take our terms and put them back, even the very term religion, I mean, there's no term in Arabic for religion, um, even contemporary period, but let alone in the seventh century of the Common Era. So I think that we have to be careful. So what I mean, I guess, going meta, we have to interrogate the very terms that we use to apply to the period in question: religion, ecumenicism, faith, Jew, Christian, Muslim. Um, so I think that's what I mean by that, and I think too little of that reflection goes on, and it's unfortunate. I mean, even just to call Islam a religion is a problematic term because Islam, on the one hand, is a world religion, but the term world religion is I think, an 18th century European invention.
So given all of these sort of meta questions and these methodological and ideological tensions, why do you think Islamic origins is such a powerful case study for thinking theory through theory and method in religious studies more broadly? So
Mm.
why is this topic such a flashpoint for the field in general?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's I think it's a good to me it's an important an important phenomenon to study for almost for reasons that I've articulated. If the critical study of religion, and by the critical study of religion, I really do mean that we don't take things for granted, that we don't talk about the sacred and ecumenicism. To me, that's more kind of constructive theology, and too often that passes for critical religious studies. But if we're going to take critical religious seriously, and that is, where do our terms come from? What does it mean when we take our terms and apply them onto other times and other places? What does it mean when what does it mean when we take even terms like Islam, Muslim, Christian, Jew, and put them on to the earliest period in the seventh century CE? I think there's a real slippage. So I think if we become more attuned to that, I think looking at Islamic origins makes us ask fundamental questions. What does it mean to be a Jew? What does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to be a Muslim in the first 30 years after the death of the prophet, or even during the time of the prophet? Like, what do these questions mean? We can't assume that Islam fell, fully formed from the heavens. I mean, it had to be articulated through fiqh, through kalam, through all sorts of things. And this only occurs much later. But I think there's a tendency to take what occurred much later and then put it back on the time and period. And then we have this slippage. So I think that the study of Islamic origins has a lot to offer the critical study of religion by making us rethink what it is we're doing and be careful of retrojection. And I think so much of people that work on Islamic origins, whether that's people like Fred Donner, whether that's people like William Cantwell Smith, or the name escapes me, the person who wrote Watt, W. Montgomery Watt, Muhammad in Mecca, Muhammad in Medina, that there's this projection of later ideas onto the time in question. But I think the problem, Roxana, is that not a lot of people are equipped in the critical study of religion to look at Islamic origins. So they end up saying silly things. That they end up, even if they're critical studies scholars of religion, I mean, to do Islamic origins properly, as we're now learning, is not just about knowing the Quran in Arabic. It's about knowing all those languages that the inhabitants of the Arabian Peninsula would have spoken: Sabaic, Aramaic, all I don't know if Aramaic, but Sabaic. And then I think, as you mentioned, Ahmad al-Jalad. I mean, all these epigraphy and all these on rocks and engravings on rocks. I mean, to me, this is the future of the study of Islamic origins. It's not about taking the Quran or the Sirat Rasul Allah, which was, probably codified much later, and then retrofitting it onto the time of the Prophet.
I think what you're saying about retrojection and our ability to forget that we're retrojecting sometimes really emphasizes why Islam has always, the question of the origins of Islam has always continued to be a modern question as much as a historical one, if that makes sense. But the fact that you emphasize that the origins of Islam should be seen not as an isolated problem within Islamic studies, but as something that belongs squarely within the study of late antiquity more broadly. Why do you think it's so important to shift the conversation in that direction? What kind of issues does framing Islamic origins within late antiquity studies help us grapple with more effectively?
Okay, yeah, good question. Before I I would just say that you're right, is that it is a very much a modern question, and that whether, I mean, Orientalists use the study of Islamic origins to denigrate Islam, to show that, oh yeah, it was just invented, whereas Christianity or Christianity was the true religion. And then I think other people do it too, the people that I'm critical of in Islam and the tyranny of authenticity, by saying, oh yes, if you look at the prophetic teachings, Muhammad was LGBTIQ2 plus friendly, but it was the later, male elites that somehow, so that's the two sides of the continuum. Now, what do I think the study of why I think the study of Islamic origins belongs in late antiquity is for two reasons. Is one is political, which is to show that Islam has been, and always will be in conversation with other religious traditions. So, if we see Islam as an extension of late antiquity, as opposed to the closure of late antiquity as we used to do, then Islam is something that is occurring in the Arabian Peninsula, untouched from any other religious tradition, which of course some Muslim theologians might very well like, because I mean that sort of taps into this idea of Muhammad as a Ummi prophet. Uh, but late antiquity shows that people were moving trade routes. People were thinking with other people's religious traditions and other people's mythoi or myths or of origins, and 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 they had no problems doing that. So I think that, so for politically, I think it shows us at a time when we really need to be reminded that Islam is a tradition in and of the West that has been in conversation with Christians and Jews ever since its beginning. It's not juxtaposed against them. It's not in opposition to them. It's part of this sort of late antique heritage that we've all inherited. So I think politically, I think that's why I think it's important. But then even more, I think more even historically, I think that we see in early Islam a number of the trajectories that we see in the late antique period, which is, as I said earlier, people seem to have no problems thinking with religious terms and terminologies and narratives of other people, and in many ways as absorbing their own at their own. And so again, there's this idea of retrojection where we tend to say, well, creativity is always people have to think something completely new in order for it to be creative. But until the 20th century, creativity was a much different phenomenon. It's about if you think back to Arabic poetry in the medieval period, I mean the Arabic poetry is all about not who said what first, but who said what best. So I think that's the main reason why we need to see Islam as a continuation of what went on before. And I think that's why we're so many times when we've looked at Islamic origins up until probably about the last 20 years, maybe until Patricia Crona and Michael Cook's Hagerism, we always tended to say, well, you need to know Arabic, you need to read the Qur'an, you need to read the Sirah literature, and then we can figure out what Islamic origins are. Then all of a sudden now we're kind of in the other period. Well, Arabic is important, the Quran is important, but that's all later. What's Islam emerging from? And to me, that is the most interesting question. And not to undermine Islam, far from it, but to show the ingenuity, the creativity of Islam, and also that early Muslim thinkers had absolutely no problem doing that. And we're, in fact, we're quite articulate about that's what they were doing.
Uh, just kind of going back to what you mentioned before, seems like you take an anti-essentialist approach to religious groups when studying late antique period. How does this problematize the term religion, especially in that period? I mean, yeah, that's pretty much my question. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, I hear two things there. So one is the anti-essentialism, which, yeah, definitely. I mean, anyone that tells us first of all, anyone that tells us what a Muslim is today, or what a Jew is today, or what a Christian is today, it's always a theological thing. I mean, I've lived long enough. I mean, growing up in the mosque in Edmonton, where religious people are always just making up their social worlds, cobbling together all kinds of things. So to say that Islam is X, and then to say, well, that X has to be put back on the period in question, I think is ridiculous. I think the early Muslim, and this is why I do think Donner's book is useful, because it showed whether or not it's ecumenical religion is another point. We'll get there in a second turn. But I think it was much more complicated and much more ambiguous than we give it credit for. And rather than celebrate that ambiguity, we tend to want to put these firm boundaries on it. So I think anti-essentialism is completely is de rigueur. We absolutely need to understand what it is, because I mean, what a Muslim is in the 8th century, the 9th century is not the same thing as what a Muslim is what was at the time of the Prophet. Just the same time, it's not the same thing what a Muslim is today, despite what some people might say. The
I mean, and
second,
also just reading your work, I come to find out that what it meant to be a Christian or Jew in late antiquity is most likely not what we think of those things today, and that the origins of Islam or the emergence of Islam also fed into the understandings of or the self-understandings of those communities as well. Not only that, those communities fed into the self-understanding of Islam.
yeah, yeah, I think you're right. I think that, too often Orientalists, I mean, I'm using that as kind of a heuristic device, but the Orientalist position was that Islam was unstable. It was invented by this person, whereas Christianity was the real thing. And of course, Judaism was also the real thing, because Christians needed Judaism in order to to validate its real thingness. Um, but that's absolutely ridiculous, and it's theological, and it's a lie. So I think that what I've tried to say is we should see if we see Judaism, Christianity, Islam as unstable variables in the late antique period, it's not simply that an unstable Islam is drawing off a stable Christianity and a stable Judaism. it's quite the opposite. They're all, and this is where late antiquity and what happened before Islam teaches us something, that you have a lot of unstable social groups that are defining themselves in light of the other, using the same vocabulary and using the exact same terms. So I think so I think that that's essential for us to remember. If not, we're just getting into this idea that we're just repeating what the Orientalists said. So what I've tried to do is say that rather than see Islam as well, rather an unstable Islam drawing on the stable other traditions, I think what we have to say is, well, what the heck? Who the heck were the Jews of the Arabian Peninsula? Who were the Jews that Muhammad would have interacted with in Medina? I mean, they weren't Talmudic Jews, because Talmudic Jews was the Talmud and Rabbinic Judaism was just being articulated in Babylon, and didn't have the internet back then. So it's like, how are you how is that normative Judaism, which probably isn't even normal at this point, getting to the Arabian Peninsula? And even the Christians that existed on the Arabian Peninsula weren't, they probably would have been like Monophysite or other types of Christians. So I think we have to appreciate instability, and from that instability we have this mutual recognition of each other, and its self-definition, using, as I said earlier, the same terms and narratives that the others are using. And then maybe just to go back for a second is the term, to even call it a religion is, there's a lot of critical work in religious studies that say religion is a Christian term. It's our term that we use in the West, that comes out of particular debates between religious and secularism in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. And then to say that, well, other people have this is the ultimate in colonialism. And that sometimes the example we use in religious studies that I use, if let's assume the Polynesians were the most powerful people on earth, and the Polynesians have manna, right? So if the Polynesians were the most powerful people on earth, they would go around colonizing the world and say, well, what's your manna? And then if we were Muslims, we'd have to say, well, I guess we have to, well, what's manna? So we have to sort of contort our religion, put it into the context of mana, and then so this is essentially what we've done is we made other cultures speak about religion, even though they have no indigenous or autochthonous terms for concepts such as religion or religiosity or spirituality or maybe even faith.
And I think that's really interesting in the sort of broader context of Islamic studies now, because we're getting through works like produced by like Mohsen Qadazi, we're having new understandings of terms like deen and how that fits into the late antique period and how that doesn't coalesce with the concept of religion. And so when a scholar like Fred Donner argues in Mohammedan Believers that Islam began as a religious movement, would you say that that's an anachronistic way of framing things, particularly because he was kind of trying to combat sort of limited framings of what he conceived of as the movement done by other scholars? But does his own framing also limit our understanding of how Islam developed as a movement within late antiquity?
Yeah, yeah, I think it does, and I think we it, it's hard. One of my favorite Canadian bands, the Tragically Hip, has a lyric called "We live to survive our paradoxes," and I think I really love that lyric, and I think that people, what Donner is doing is in making it into a religious ecumenical movement. As you say, he's trying to counter narratives that saw it as a political movement, just like those people after 9/11 that said, if you look at Islam properly, you see that it is ecumenical, it's open-ended, it's inclusive, it doesn't condone violence. It had to be said, but at the same time, I think if we're going to be academics, we have to ask another set of questions. So maybe those people after 9/11 had to say that so that people in the United States weren't, going out and attacking their Muslim neighbors. So it was very much necessary, but the other shoe never quite dropped, which is like, well, okay, let's historicize this thing. Let's see how Muslim groups talk about things. And maybe there's somewhat, under this broad canopy of Islam, there's some maximalists and some minimalists. How do we approach that? So to go back to Donner, I think I think you're right. It was a reaction to people that said Islam, that the Mohammedan movement was largely political, and he's saying, well, wait a minute, it's also religious, which is important because he's countering a dominant narrative. But unfortunately, I would have liked for him to have at least had footnotes where he says, I'm aware that terms like ecumenicism, I'm aware that the term like religion is not autochthonous to the time in question. It's a term that comes out of this particular genealogy. And when we apply it to that, we have to be aware that there's going to be a certain amount of slippage. Therefore, we need to dot dot dot. So I love that book, Muhammad and the Believers. I think it's a great book, and I think it's important in the sense that it says, well, it really would have begun as this open-ended movement and only gradually took shape as as various questions were asked and we needed various legal answers. But there is a problem in using the term religion in a culture that didn't have the term.
And do you think that the question of Islamic origins itself is inherently multidisciplinary? You've already touched on sort of like the importance, for example, of epigraphy and archaeology and etc. But how do academics who are specialists in one field answer a question that requires a multidisciplinary, broad approach?
Yeah. Well, I think I would say, having worked a lot with European colleagues, is that it's an ERC project, the European Research Council, where you're drawing on people from that look at social movements. Like even I mean, for me, religion is a social movement. It always is. All religious movements are social movements in the past and the present. So wouldn't it be interesting if you were to look at the study of Islamic origins, if you had this multifaceted research team where you have someone that looks at the creation of new religious movements today? What does that have to say about the study of Islamic origins or Christian origins or Jewish origins or whatever? Um, you certainly need the linguistic skills with the realization that Arabic might not even be the first language to help study Islamic origins. Certainly need the epigraphic skills and archaeological skills, historical. So I do think it's a lot to ask. But I'm really I don't have I don't have my own research has sort of moved into Islam in Canada recently. But I take great satisfaction or great trust in the fact that we have people like Philip Wood, Jack Tanis, and Ilka Lindstad working on this today because they're well trained and they're doing the necessary work. Or Ahmad Al-Jalad. And I think that to me, that's the future. And they're asking questions informed by, I think, this multi or interdisciplinarity in ways that the way we've traditionally looked at Islamic origins in religious studies just hasn't done so. It's simply been content, as I said, to read the Qur'an and the Sirah, and from that just simply just summarize that and say, well, that's what Islamic origins look like. And so it's exciting. I think it's an exciting time. And then if we can put that in counterpoint with what people are working on in late antique Christianity or late antique Judaism, then we have this fascinating conversation. But I think the problem is, I know we've been touching on politics a little bit here and there, is that where does that fit in the contemporary university? It's hard to tell. So maybe this goes back to the question that Taryn asked earlier, and that is, I think it's going to be very rare that a university, at least in North America, or maybe even in the UK, is going to say, we want someone to come and teach Islamic origins.
Mm.
You're saying it's
And I
going to
think,
be very
yeah,
rare
go ahead.
for someone in the Euro North American academies to say that we want somebody to teach Islamic origins.
Yeah, and in fact, I think it might be more interesting to say someone we have, but see how many programs in late antiquity are there? They're kind of universities are very conservative things. They like antiquity, they like medieval, They like modern. You start to move in between them, they get a little bit uncomfortable. They don't know what to do with it. But to me, I would say that positions, if there are to be positions in Islamic origins in the future, those positions would be in late antiquity studies or late antique studies. Um, but I don't know what the future holds. Thank goodness, I guess.
I think also, like we touched on earlier, the fear around the whole topic of Islamic origins at an academic level is sort of influenced by the current geopolitical context and the fact that scholarship in Islamic studies can often be sort of appropriated by political actors with more nefarious agendas. And in our social media age, that's not just state level or institutional actors, that's even ordinary individuals with platforms like popular YouTubers or people on social media in general, using academic work in questionable ways to push certain
Yeah.
narratives. How do scholars best navigate that landscape? And how much does that broader context shape what people in the field feel comfortable publishing in the first place?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's I think of was it Pete Hegseth in the current Trump administration that has a tattoo that says Kafir on his arm,
Interesting.
which is maybe I think the best example for that of that. But you're right. This will be picked up on, and it's a question that I didn't concern me all that much, and when I was first starting out. But now, I mean, it's anyone that is so some people Islamophobes have picked up my work because I'm critical of some people that study Islam. You have to look through all my work. I don't think you'd ever find anything in which I'm critical of Islam or Muslims, but I've been critical of some of the methodological and theoretical lenses that have been used to study it. And because, influencers, I think is the nom du jour. Um, they have no problem picking up on these things. So you're right. It's an incredibly politically fraught subject, and we're always encouraged to make our findings more popular. But the Islamic origins could be used to undermine the tradition. But I think this goes back to a question I raised earlier, and now I'm sort of thinking out loud, is that I think Muslims, I mean, are proud of their tradition. It's a lovely tradition that's ancient and has all this breadth and depth and diversity and ambiguity to it that haters are going to hate. And I mean, silly people are going to say silly things. But the key is that, well, I mean, one has this tradition, so you have to rely on the beauty of one's tradition.
And that's why
So
I really think not trying to say Islam is A, Islam is B, really kind of gets you out of that situation when you look at it as if it's the whole alphabet, so to speak, rather than just trying to single it out to one letter, which tends to be your own particular interpretation in a world of interpretations just within, the study of Islam itself.
yeah, yeah, and right. And so if someone in the Trump administration wants to have a tattoo that says "kafir" on him, so what? I mean, it's just silly, crazy. Why do that? You want to mark yourself as a kafir? Go right ahead. So I think that I think that I I I I think though, and this is I think the problem of people like, and maybe this is going to be a question. I don't want to go into it too much, but or maybe it's a segue, and it's people like Ibn Waraq and the Inara group is that they they're unapologetically Islamophobic. Well, Ibn Waraq more so than perhaps Inara, but I mean, and you just avoid them. I mean, it's just like, well, I mean, I don't think Ibn Waraq is seen at all as a valid source in Islamic studies or Islamic origins. People like some of these Islamophobes in the States will pick them up and and do things with them, but it's it's a tough question, Roxanne, and I'm not quite sure how to get out of it other than to say that what I'm proposing, how we study it, that we show the messiness of it is one way to do it. But of course, Islamophobes and people that want to undermine Islam are very rarely into messiness. They're into black and white and hard boundaries. And the minute you begin to try to articulate or nuance that to them, their eyes glaze over.
Well, then how can non-specialists or lay readers come to recognize when scholarship is being framed in such a way to serve ideological purposes rather than historical inquiry? Because, whereas I don't get many inquiries about the work of Ibn Wardak, I do, and from some Muslims, get emails or questions about certain scholars who are a part of the Inara Institute and what do I think about their work? How should their work be received? Because they do kind of have this mask of that what they're doing is a scholarly endeavor. And for people like myself who are non-specialists, lay people, they don't know how to make sense of that because, they are coming from what seems to be an academic perspective. But then when you look at the people who they associate with and then the type of people who like to cite them, you see something quite different.
Yeah, yeah. That that's a great question. I'm trying to think how. I mean, I think for your readers and for your listeners, I think one of the best things is Google is to sort of see who these people are, where they come from. I think another good example to look at is to maybe look at the presses that publish these things.
Mm.
Um, so if it's not like, I'm not trying to be a snob or anything, but if it's like Oxford University Press, Columbia University Press, some of these places, usually they have to go through peer review, and hopefully peer review has done its job. Um, but I think yeah, it's a real question, and I'm trying to think how I would respond if I had a room full of Muslims who are interested in this question. I could easily just say, well, show me the book and I can tell you. Maybe let me come back at that from another perspective. I'm not sure if the article that you read and that you were asking me about, I did that, but I know in another article I published in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion around the same time, I tried to create a roadmap of various, genealogies of where the study of Islam comes from. So I think maybe listeners could try to plug a name into that. Um, but I think a lot. I think Prometheus Press in New York State publishes a lot of Ibn Waraq and these people. And so I'm not sure how useful that would be to your listeners, but it's it's a problem, and I wonder if people in other religions have the same issue, like, people that are Christians and are looking at interested in Christian origins, like where do they go? Um, so
That would that actually is a really good question because it seems like Christian origins a lot. It seems like the people who focus on Christian origins, who happen to be non-Christian, it doesn't seem they seem to be. How do I want to put this? Because I'm pretty sure they get pushback, but it seems like what they're doing is more accepted amongst Christians and Jews. I'm pretty sure maybe like 100 years ago, when all of this critical research into those traditions started, or whenever it started, there was a significant pushback, but it seems to be more accepted. And I've even read papers by from Christian theologians who have also gone into the academic sphere of learning about Christianity, who celebrate the historical critical method. I mean, I know there are Muslim scholars who in the academy who do the same, but it just seems like this topic of Christian origins, and I want to believe Jewish origins, which I know a lot less about, is more well received.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it might. I would think, and I know people that work in Christians or origins, including a couple of Jewish colleagues, and I think they're always getting pushback. Maybe not from sort of the more mainline churches, but from more evangelical approaches who, they often get emails from people saying, well, you've done this wrong or you've done that wrong. So I think it is. I think any study of the origins of religion is going to be met with resistance in some circles. But the question you asked, Taryn, is to me is a much more interesting one, and that is how do believers navigate that minefield? I mean, I think probably the one of the easiest ways to do that is to read everything critically and just realize that everything you're reading is a secondary source. It's not a primary source, and that it's that there are problems with it, and that they might be trying to convince people of certain things. I think that's why the Inara group was a little bit more difficult because, on the one hand, their website that their goal is to encourage a reformation in Islam. Some of the people that work with it and that have been to it are more, I don't think that's necessarily their goal and are more, firmly rooted in historical method.
I mean, talking about Ibn Mubarak in particular, one response to sort of work produced by those sorts of ideologues is that exemplified on the other opposite of the dichotomy by Dr. Joseph Lombard, who in his presentation delivered at SOAS entitled sort of Decolonizing Quranic Studies set out an approach. How would you define the sort of response, and what concerns do you have with the approach to Islamic studies advocated by people like Dr. Lombard? And what would be the consequences for the field if it was widely adopted?
Yeah, yeah. Now that's a good question, and um, I think this is the new iteration of some of the theological approaches I had in the tyranny of authenticity. Um, and my original response, like 10 years ago when I wrote that, would have been just to have sort of written it off. As I said, given my work on the Canadian Constitution and Indigenous critiques, I'm a little bit more amenable to it. And I certainly think he's right in some ways, like when he says, the study of the Qur'an has proceeded as if, German Orientalists from the 19th century are more important than indigenous works written in Turkish or Arabic or Persian. I get that. I do get that. Um, and it takes me back to a point I made earlier, and that is I'd like to see rather than just the odd article in which you're invoking this, I would like to see maybe let's call it a manifesto of what a decolonized approach to the study of Islam would look like. And that was going to be something where you don't just rely on indigenous terms and indigenous methodology, because then it just becomes a work of kalam, and we have plenty of those. If you're going to study Islam in the Western university, and you're going to make a call for decolonization, then you have to convince us why, using our language, that should be the case. So I think that would be my response now to people like Professor Lombard. Um, and I think but I also think there's a I'm trying to think if I want to. No, I think I'm content to leave it at leave it I think in no, I think so. I think so. I would say like let's actually see what that would look, because if not, if you're just going to say if you're just going to use insider language where people in the religious studies or people in late antique studies that don't work on Islam can't understand you, then it's a failure. So, and not only is it a failure, I mean, I don't want to see the future university look like, well, on the first floor we have the Christian seminary, where their Christians are working out all their Christian stuff. On the second floor, we got the Jewish yeshiva, where everyone's just doing insider Jewish yeshiva speak, articulating concerns for the Jewish community. And then on the third floor, we have the madrasa, where you have a bunch of Muslim clerics who may be white, who may not be white, who may be converts, who may not be converts, who are articulating um, Muslim positions on certain things, and they're not communicating to one another. So I think we have to be careful that we don't silo ourselves off even further. And while I'm all for what a decolonial approach to the study of Islam would look like, it has to be articulated paradoxically in language that in a non-jargony way that those of us who don't necessarily buy into it can argue with and digest and struggle with because that's ultimately what we do is in the academy. So I think that it's yeah, I think that to reiterate, I think I'm a little bit more sympathetic than I was, but it has to be done properly. And I don't think I've yet seen it done properly.
Okay, so that leads to my next question. Would you not consider the study Quran as an example of the kind of approach that Dr. Lombard advocates? I
Yeah,
mean,
I mean, I think in many ways it is. I haven't looked at it for a while, but it's all insiders speaking devotionally to one another, and I think it's meant for Muslims, which is good. I think that's important. I think the more critical or semi-critical resources that Muslims have to understand their tradition, the better. I mean, it's only going to make Muslims stronger and in their belief, all for the good. But in terms of theory and method, and in terms of we have to ask ourselves, well, what's going on here? And that's where I think what I tried to do in that article is sort of look at some of the language that is used. So you can't just. I think it's maybe almost the opposite of Cook and Krona when Cook and Krona said in the Origins of Hagerism that this is a book written by infidels for infidels and anyone with a grain of faith will find this. I think that's the opposite. It's like it shut out critical Western scholarship. So maybe if we have Cook and Krona as a thesis, if we have the study of Quran as the antithesis, maybe, just maybe we get that Hegelian synthesis somewhere. I'm not sure what that would look like. But I do think you can't like I mean there's a Jewish study Bible which is good. There's a Christian study Bible. Why shouldn't there be a Quran? So but to mistake that for well not for critical scholarship or to I think is a problem, and I don't think it claims to be use critical scholarship. I mean, I think at some point they even say like we're not interested in any of the scholarship that looks critically at the Quran from a historical perspective, which is fine. At least they say it.
I mean, if you were to imagine a truly critical or scholarly version of a Quran project, such as the study Quran, what would that look like? And what would need to be done differently for it to meet the standards of historical inquiry that you
Yeah,
propose?
good question. I think it's been done a little bit. There's the translation by A.J. Droge, Droge, who tries to do all kinds of formal and form criticism and source criticism. And so it's a translation of the Quran. Highly probably each chapter, each page has maybe about a quarter of the page is the text, and then the rest are all footnotes. And he shows how terms, the Arabic terms in the text, have cognates in other languages. Now he's a biblical scholar. He wasn't trained in Islamic studies or Islamic origins, and I don't know how well he knows things like, Ahmad al-Jalad does, but I think that that's the opposite of what the study Quran is doing. Droge uh, did his translation for people in biblical studies or people in Islamic studies that are interested in source criticism.
Mm,
And I don't think in the study Bible by Nasser and others that there's even the mention of source criticism.
mm. In a recent podcast on decolonizing Islamic studies, Joseph Lombard, who often is critical of the historical critical approaches, actually mentioned Angelica Norworth's work as valuable for Muslims. He specifically pointed to her idea that the Quran can be understood as a text addressing the concerns of late antiquity, and that doing so doesn't require us to accept or reject it theologically. I found that very interesting. What do you make of that kind of move or that kind of claim? or that kind of take? Does it represent a meaningful shift in how insider scholars are engaging with the historical critical approach?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say no. I would say it's good, and I think there's all kinds of ways that one does this. I mean, one can talk about, and I've seen this in other people, especially some of these books that come out, like feminist edges of the Qur'an, written by some of my colleagues here, and they get into this almost this German idealist philosophical position that there's an eternal Quran and which is also sort of goes back to the Islamic tradition itself, that there's an eternal Quran that exists untouched by history, by culture, so if you can separate those two, then I think you have no problem doing that. And I might also say that I think Neuwirth's position is now seen as fairly old-fashioned in the study of Islamic origins. I think she's great. I think she's the doyen of Islamic origins in late antiquity in Germany. But there's new younger people that are doing more interesting things. And I'm not quite sure what Lombard would say about Jack Tanis. I'm not quite sure what he'd say about Ilka Lindstad. I'm not quite sure what he'd say about Philip Wood's work. I'd like to think, and I really do think that that these traditions can be combined, and these intellectual traditions can be combined in some way. I think Majid Danishgar, a colleague of mine who now teaches in Kyoto in Japan, we co-edited a book called Deconstructing Islamic Studies, where we took some of these big terms like tasawwuf, tafsir, Quran, hadith, kalam, and we tried to get a set of scholars to think about each term both as a indigenous Arabic term and in the early Islamic tradition, and also how it's been applied to the modern period and in sort of Western secular scholarship, and to bring out some of the tensions. So like I have no problem, calling the Bible the Jewish Quran or something like that. But so I think we just have to be aware of this. But it strikes me that I think identity politics is making it very difficult to bring these two things together. And I think one of the things that I tried to bring up in the rhetoric of authenticity is something that we don't always talk about, and that what does it mean to be a convert to Islam? What does it mean when you're sort of when you're a white guy, and all of a sudden you convert, and then you move from an outsider to an insider?
Mm,
And it's fine. Like life is a journey. We all go through all kinds of journeys. But give us some reflection, man. Give us some reflection on what it means to switch religious traditions and why I'm not talking about Lombard in particular, but why are you now writing as an insider? And what does it mean to move from the outsider to the insider? I think that's really important because I remember Omid Safi and we had this huge debate a few years ago, and I was like, Omid, we should like kind of take this on the road, and we both have different ideas of Islamic studies. Let's sort of, maybe we could, make some money from this. I'm joking.
mm.
and and but he was like, no, I won't talk to you. So we're in these polarized worlds when we would think the academy is a place where we could roll up our sleeves and hash out some of these. But I think identity politics reigns supreme, and so maybe let me just come as I'm sympathetic to the project of Joseph Lombard. I want to see what it would actually look like. But once I see what it actually looks like, I would like to see him and me, or various iterations of him and various iterations of me, be able to like hash it out the way academics do, and find some common ground, because I'm now open to this.
And I find that a lot of academics are open to speaking, speaking with somebody who has an opposite on the opposing end of what they believe, especially from someone who is quote unquote an insider working within the academy. And I think the people, our audience especially, would love seeing something like that, just to see both perspectives laid on the table and not necessarily hashed out in like a debate style, argumentative, but just a discussion on both positions, see how there's some kind of reconciliation that could be made, or or something. I don't have any ideas on what that would be, but just to see two people on opposite ends of the spectrum sitting down having a conversation about the topic would be phenomenal in my opinion.
So too, I completely think so. Yeah, but I think identity politics makes that difficult because when you're critiquing someone's position now, you're not just critiquing their academic position, you're critiquing the very core of their being. You're critiquing their identity, which makes it extremely difficult. And then oftentimes the knee-jerk reaction is just shut up, you're a white guy.
Mm.
So it's difficult, but I completely agree, Taryn. This would be maybe this is for a future podcast is to sit two people down, give them parameters and see how they can how they would address this because I think it would benefit your viewers because it doesn't have to be either or.
Because I just got an email recently from someone who asked if I can get Dan Gibson and Ahmed Al-Jalad on the platform together. And I didn't know, I haven't responded. I don't know what to make of that because of how Dan Gibson is kind of seen with it. I don't even think he's really an academic. And from what I understand, he's more of a missionary who knows a lot about archaeology, but isn't academically trained from what I understand. But maybe someone not like Dan Gibson. I don't know who's on the opposite side of Ahmed Al-Jalad, but yeah. So just to give you an example, that people actually want to see something like that. So
Well, if you want to have me and Joseph Lombard on, I'd be more than happy to have a conversation with them. Like not and I agree with you, Taryn. Not a debate. Oh my, I look at like Americans always if everything is a debate, it's a political debate and debates reward rhetoric. They don't reward, you know, thought. They don't reward yeah, but I think it's a great idea. And not for your viewers. And I
I
think that
think,
might help. Sorry, Roxanne.
sorry, I just think framing those things as constructive discussions rather than debates
I-
is far more beneficial than.
Completely, completely, and it's yeah. I think it would be invaluable. I really do.
In your analysis of a number of different academic approaches that you touch upon in your work, you identified that contemporary Salafism and religious literalism often seem to sort of lurk in the background as ideas and beliefs that scholars or schools of thought in the field are unknowingly or even unknowingly responding to. Why does contemporary Salafism continue to have such a haunting influence in Islamic studies? And do you envision this changing in the future at any point?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think historically, um, I think just sort of given the sheer numbers of the Sunni tradition, I think that given the wealth of Gulf states, I think that and not just, I mean, so many of the universities are a flood with money, whether it's dirty or clean or whatever. I'm not going to get into it, but you have positions in Jewish studies, you have positions in Israel studies, you have positions in Islamic studies. I think the program at Georgetown is funded by Gulf money, and I'm not saying that there's necessarily a connection. I'm not going to go there. I'll leave it for others to do that. But I just if you have the money and you can create translations and create all kinds of things, and I think you can have an influence, not just on the Islamic world, but I also think on the way the Islamic world is interpreted and studied in the West. I was going to say something but I do, I see recently, and I say this is kind of come from a Shia background, is I think Shia studies is making a real not I don't want to say comeback, but there's a lot of people that are now working in Shi studies.
Mhm.
There's a Journal of Shi Studies. I think of Sabina Schmidtka and Hassan Ansari at Princeton. I think of Sajjad Rizvi down in Exeter. People I've been involved with the Al Mahdi Institute in Birmingham.
I really
So
like a
there,
lot of what they at least release on YouTube that I see from them. Very, very interesting institute.
yeah, 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 and they're a nice bunch. And then I always think of I've spent a lot of time in London at the Aga Khan University in the Institute of Ismaili Studies and the Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations. So I do think maybe because I'm working a lot in Shia, like I have a book coming out on the history of Islam of Ismaili Muslims in Canada. So I've been working a lot with that, but I do agree there's a Sunni centrism. I don't know if I want to call it a Salafi centrism, but there's a Sunni centrism in the field that I think people are. Another person I forgot that I think I'm very fond of his work is Sean Anthony and some of the work that he's done. I put him up there with Ilka and those others. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's it's interesting. I think that but unfortunately, that Ismaili studies I would like to see become more into the center of Islamic studies, but I worry sometimes that it's sort of kept on the margins, and I'm not sure whose fault that is,
Mm.
given the sort of historical position of Ismailis within the larger Islamic world. I don't know, but I agree. But I also think that so much of the way we teach it, when I first started to teach Islam, I would sort of talk about Islam as, radical monotheism and Tawheed and all this kind of thing. And then I began to think, goodness, this is just the way a Salafi would want me to teach it. What about all those lovely, like, this cult of saints and that to me makes Islam so rich and is one part of this wonderful tapestry. So even if we're not the field and the way we teach Islam and the way we are accustomed to think about it, and therefore the way we disseminate it to others, non-Muslims, often has this bias in it.
Mhm. As someone, I also come from a Shi background, and as someone where like sort of shrine culture is incredibly important back home and things like that, that to see that not really being discussed in the academic world was always quite alienating.
It's amazing,
Um,
isn't it? And in some of these shrines, I mean, you have like Hindus and Muslims, and they're they're ecumenical. They're yeah, no, it's and we rarely teach that.
Although that is a future podcast that we have planned to be announced on, whereas we did a podcast on Islamic Muslim burial, we're planning on doing one that talks about what goes on top of the burial, which happens to be shrines and
Lovely.
gravestones and stuff like that. So look out for that in the future. Um, but
so
yeah, go ahead.
no, I was going to ask about your use of social theory, which is something that we've not really touched on yet. You talked about the importance and how use of social theory can add to the field of late antique studies and the study of Islamic origins in particular.
Mm,
How has sort of social theory, just for our audience to understand, how has it been used to effectively break down artificial and confessional boundaries in the study of early Judaism and Christianity, and what do you think it can bring to the study of Islamic origins?
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, I think I mean, I'll just give you an example. I think of someone like Pierre Bourdieu, who's very technical, very French, very jargony, but he has
Mhm.
a book on distinction, and there he tries to argue that, taste, something that we think is universal, is actually a social construct.
mhm,
So how different cultures experience taste, what tastes good, what tastes bad, what tastes sweet, what tastes sour, is not natural. It doesn't exist in the world. It's culturally constructed. Or I think of another French theorist, Jean-François Bayard, who talks about the illusion of cultural identity and the way, identity, we think that identity and the way we ground it in the past and we assume it's so real, it's so tangible through things like nationalism, through things like the idea of the nation, but they're also very modern constructs, but they're so powerful because we project them into the distant past. So I think that social theory has a lot to teach us because it shows us that these boundaries that we think exist in the past might be as invented or as fictive as the ones we have today.
mm.
So I think but it is sometimes very jargony, which is a problem.
All right. this has actually been a really, I actually like this podcast. I mean, I liked all my podcasts, but this, but this one really went by quick. I'm surprised that we got it done in like under an hour, 30 minutes. And we covered a lot of topics, from methodological minefields to political pressures, shaping the study of Islamic origins today. Professor Hughes, if there's one thing you hope future scholars to take away from your work, as well as lay people, non-scholarly people like ourselves, to take away from your work, what would it be? And for those of us who aren't scholars, like I just mentioned, but are still deeply interested in these questions, regardless of background or confession, what would you want us to keep in mind when engaging with these topics?
There's I'm trying to think. I like comedy. I'm a big fan of comedy. I do some stand-up comedy. There's Larry David. I don't know if your listeners will know who Larry David
Yeah, I know
is.
Lily Davis.
Larry David has a line where he says, I'm not an inventor. I don't make things. I'm an improver. I improve things that are broken, and the system is clearly broken.
Mm,
So maybe I would say that I've tried to ask some questions. I've tried to intervene in some debates. My new work has now moved into sort of, I'm determined to write the histories of Muslims in Canada. So I'm doing that. But the things that we've talked about today were things that I saw as really problematic in the study of Islam. I didn't claim to always offer solutions to them, but I wanted to articulate things. Um, and I think that's important. So I think that I would want my work to be seen as someone who wasn't afraid to ask particular questions and to try to shift and orient the field in a particular way that was a little bit more honest. And then in terms of fellow Muslims, I would say. It goes back to what I said at the beginning. I mean, Islam is a big, bold, beautiful, ambiguous, multifaceted tradition, and I think that scholarship can show that, and not to be afraid of it, not to be afraid of scholarship, and it doesn't undermine faith. In fact, if anything, I think showing this depth and breadth of Islam encourages faith and makes it deeper. So I think a deep faith in which one can hold together a number of different items is is worth it. And I think that's what makes religion possible. Like should make religion possible, especially in a time when a lot of people are offering very neat and tidy solutions to very complex problems.
definitely.
I think if there's one thing we hope, Taron and I both hope that people take away from our channel is not to be afraid of scholarship.
Amen. Amen. Yeah,
All right.
completely.
Well, thank you, Professor Hughes, for your time. This has been a very enlightening conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed reading your book, The Tyranny of Authenticity, as well as the article that we've been discussing today. And I wish you would release more of your articles on your academia edu page. I found that a number of them, were by request only. I mean, I guess people can simply always just ask you. That's not too difficult to do. But yeah, I really enjoyed what I have read from your work, and I hope to read more of it. Do you have any idea of when the history of Muslim
Two
Canadian?
books, right? So the first one is called Islam, a Canadian History, which I hope it's the University of Toronto Press. I hope it's coming out next year or so. And then the other one is a history of Ismaili Muslims in Canada. I don't know. I mean, I'm hoping the next year or so they'll both be out, inshallah.
God willing.
Yeah.
And you do have a book out that with Lev Stamberg
Stenberg, yeah, yeah,
on Islam and football. I know that you have a fancy title for it, but it's
yeah.
basically Islam and football. If you want to just tell people what that's about, I did watch a
Yeah,
talk you and him had on it, and I found it really interesting. I thought it was because football is not something I'm really into. But I just decided to watch the talk you and Stenberg had, just had some time, and I found it to be a really interesting conversation.
oh, thanks. Yeah, well, it's called The Beautiful Game on a Muslim Pitch, which is an edited volume that looks at a series of case studies from Turkey to Lebanon to there's also a chapter on Israel, football in Israel in there, and it's an attempt to try to show the complexity of I mean, it's not about foot. None of the case studies are about football, but they're about the way football offers a window onto these often subterranean or Byzantine ideas that involve immigration, culture, society, religion. So I actually have another new book coming out on what I call the football paradox on religion, nationalism, and globalization. So I'm very much, now that I'm older and a full professor, I write on whatever I want to write on, and although I don't enjoy football as much now that I write on it, but that's that. So I've been watching a lot of ice hockey.
All right. Well,
It's open access, by the way. That the book on with Life and I is open access, so it's free online.
yeah, if I was still working around Manchester United players and City players like I used to, some of them coming from Muslim backgrounds, I would have recommended your book, but it was a missed opportunity. I didn't find out about your book until after I stopped working with people like that. So, but
Oh, really? You worked with them, eh? Wow, that's
well, where because I work in property management. And so where I was working in Manchester happened to be like one of the most popular buildings to stay in Manchester at the moment. And we would get a lot of United and City players, as well as staff members. And yeah, I just really wish I had a chance to recommend your book to some of them.
ah,
That would have been a really good,
ah,
interesting opportunity.
yeah, really, eh? Well,
Well, who knows?
thanks. I wish I'd known. I wish that but
Manchester
anyway,
City Center is a small place, so if I bump into one of them and they
okay,
recognize me,
that's
I
right.
definitely will give your book a plug. So, but
Right.
on that note, not to hold up any more of your time, I really enjoyed this conversation,
I
and
loved it. Thank you.
definitely interested in having you back for more topics. Yeah, on that note, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you both and Roxana. I really appreciate it. I love talking to you both. And thank you for allowing me to, I hope, express my ideas in a way that your viewers could f find enjoyable and helpful, I hope, yes.
No, no, I believe so. You touched on a lot of what I receive in emails from Muslims concerning, what to make of the current state of academia dealing with Islamic origins. So I think you really did answer a lot of those questions. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. And keep up the good work. I
Oh,
really
no, we
appreciate
definitely
it.
will.
All
All right.
right.
Bye.
Bye.